The next poet I'd like to talk about, introduce if necessary today, is Bronwen Wallace. She was born in Kingston, Ontario in 1945, and that's where she died in 1989 in rather tragic circumstances. She did her BA and MA degrees at Queen's University, then moved to Windsor in 1970 when she founded a women's bookstore at the time when that was a new concept, and became an activist in social justice and women's issues. Then she returned to Kingston, teaching at Queen's and at St. Lawrence College, and she wrote a weekly column on feminist issues for the Kingston Week Standard, back when it was a great newspaper. And she also worked in a women's shelter for a time, an experience that she writes about in The Stubborn Particulars of Grace. It was very emotionally taxing, as you can imagine, and to give that up at a certain point. Her first collection of poems didn't appear until she was 35, but in the last decade of her life she published 4 books and also produced a couple of films with her husband, including one that's a portrait of 4 of her poetic peers, Robert Priest, Mary de McKelly, Pier Giorgio de Chico, and Carolyn Smart. So if we can find that one, we could perhaps spread it over four evenings at Tree. And after her death in 1989, her friend Carolyn Smart edited 3 more books, one of poetry, one of short stories, and one of essays. There was also a very interesting exchange of letters published, letters that she exchanged with Erin Murray, edited by Susan McMaster of Ottawa. It was called Two Women Talking, and it's an interesting exchange about, well, Erin's discovery of language-centered poetry and Bronwen's kind of pushback, saying, well, you could change the language, but what we'd like to change is society. And if you can find that, it's an interesting exchange. After her death, there was a Bronwen Wallace Memorial Award created for an emerging writer under the age of 35, and our guest this evening, Alison Pick, is a winner of that award, so it's kind of appropriate. So I knew Bronwen a little bit, dating back to the late 70s when she was a poetry editor at Quarry magazine and accepted some of my work. Later on, in the late 80s, I was on the editorial board of Arc magazine, and we decided to put out a special issue featuring 2 writers who were just coming into their own, and we chose Don Mackay and Bronwen Wallace. Now, if you can imagine what would have happened to Canadian poetry in the past 20 years without Don Mackay, that's sort of what how much we lost when Bronwen Wallace died. Actually, in 1989, the year of her death, I was organizing a reading called Rites of Spring for the League of Canadian Poets. I invited Bronwen Wallace, and she accepted, but a few weeks before she was to give that reading, she phoned me up and said that she'd been diagnosed with cancer of the mouth, which was, well, she was confident she was going to beat it, but it's a terrible condition, and it took her rather quickly. In those last months and weeks, she was at home in Kingston, and some of her large circle of friends were there with her all the time, taking care of her, and we in Ottawa, kind of looked on, hoping for the best. The last I heard from Bronwen was that she had read the anthology of Ottawa poets that I had edited and liked it. And in, I think it was August of 1989, a group of the poets from that anthology gathered for a dinner at Blaine Marchand's place. We were talking about Bronwen. There happened to be an eclipse of the moon that night, and so I have a picture of the group of us in Blaine's backyard watching the eclipse of the moon. And it's notable that at least 2 poems came out of that evening dedicated to Bronwen Wallace, and they were both published last year. Susan McMaster's poem, I've got it here, Prayers in Space. Prayers in Space was published in her new and selected book, Paper Affair, last year. And Blaine Marchand wrote one called The Eclipse, which was published in his new book, The Craving of Knives. So that gives an indication of, you know, the kind of love that Bronwen Wallace was capable of inspiring, even at a distance. I'd like to read those poems, but I know we have more to do. We have 2 great readers coming up, so I will conclude with just one of Bronwen Wallace's poems. She talks about her vernacular narrative style, and sort of inspired by or attempting to convey the kind of women's talk around the kitchen table, the vernacular culture that we have and cherish, I guess should cherish even more. And I guess coincidentally, or appropriately anyway, the poem I've chosen is kind of an elegy for a friend long lost. It's called Coming Through, and I think it's an example of the way her poems are stories and yet flow. There's a section of the poems in Stubborn Particular Grace called Closer to Prayer Than Story, and perhaps this is what this one is, although it's from her earlier book, Common Magic. Coming Through. It's the time of day you like the best, that hour just before dark, when the colors and shapes of things seem to forget their day-lit boundaries, so that the sound of someone whistling in the street is the last pink light on the horizon, fading through other sounds of traffic and laughter into lilac, into blue-gray. Nothing is solid now. Against the sky, the trees are so still they vibrate with the effort of holding themselves in, and the walls of the houses hesitate as if they might dissolve, revealing the lives behind them, intricate and enchanted as the lives of dolls. You had a friend who opened secrets for you like that, and when you think of her now, it's mostly on evenings like this one, when the last of that light, which is itself a kind of silence, gives to the room a mirror-like quality, translucent as memory. You can almost smell the coffee you'd make for her then. See the steam rising from the blue cup, her fingers curled around it, warming themselves. You can still see the way her hands moved when she talked, creating a second language, drawing you in to the very center of her words, where the real stories lived. And her eyes, following your sentences wherever they led, until it seemed those nights you entered each other's lives as if they were other countries, not the superficial ones maps create, or ordinary conversation, but the kind that twist and plummet under a day's events, like the labyrinths you followed as a child, or the new-made world that opened for you alone when you discovered lying. You lived within each other then, and each of those nights was a place you inhabited together, a place you thought you could always return to. The headlights from a passing car outside startle the bright ghosts that gather in the corners of the room. It makes you remember the bedroom you had as a child and how you huddled under the covers like a snail, watching the goblins who lived in the dresser drawers glide across the mirror and over the ceiling into your bed. It was the smell of your teddy bear that saved you then, and the satin edge of the blanket at your cheek as smooth as sleep. It was the voices of your parents in the kitchen, far away as growing up and as safe. Even by day, your parents filled their lives with such a confidence, you believed they had been born into adulthood or arrived there years ago, before there were any history books or maps, and made it their very own sort of place. Not like you. Stubbing your toes on the furniture that changed overnight, your arms suddenly appearing from the sleeves of your favorite jacket like a scarecrow's, like somebody else. You can laugh at it now, although it's only lately you've begun to realize how much of your time you've spent like that, almost a guest in your own life, wandering around, waiting for someone or something to explain things to you. It was always late when she left, and you'd stand in the doorway, waiting until she'd started the car, then sit in the dark yourself for the 20 minutes or so it took her to drive home. As you walked up, checked the kids, you could imagine her doing the same thing, so that on those nights, sleep was just another opening, another entry you made together. She's been dead for a long time now. You thought that would make a difference, but it hasn't. Although you feel angry at your need for an explanation, it's still there, as if she owed it to you somehow, as if somebody did. Oh, you've learned the accepted wisdom of it, can even feel yourself healing these days, almost strong enough now to re-enter the places you inhabited together. And you know, you'll never figure it out at all out anyway, any more than you can understand your neighbors from what you see in their lighted windows framed like public advertisements. And yet, a part of you resists all that, resists it with the pure, unthinking stubbornness you lived in as a child, that harder wisdom you are rediscovering now. Some people are a country, and their deaths displace you. Everything you shared with them reminds you of it, part of you in exile for the rest of your life. Bronwen Wallace, a poet who should not be forgotten. Thank you.